Did you hear those ads at the beginning of this podcast? If you don't want to ever hear those again, feel free to join us on Patreon, Supercast, or Apple subscriptions. Links will be in the show notes. Explicit content is found in this episode, so listener discretion is advised.
Hey, ghoul friends. Surprise! It's me, Adrian, or Ayden. Either way, I am typically the host of a little podcast called Susto, but today I am stepping in for our dear friend, Lanie, or as I like to call her, Slaney, because unfortunately she is having a little bit of a vocal issue, so she's doing some vocal rest, which means two things. One, my witchcraft is working. I'm kidding. I would never do that to you, Slaney. And two, you're stuck with me today. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you, Lanie. Thank you, True Crime Cases with Lanie, for allowing me to step in as guest host of today's episode. With that being said, welcome back to True Crime Cases. I'm your host, Ayden. When you think about a scandal that could take place in your neighborhood, what comes to mind? Something that would have all the gossipers, curtain twitchers, and rubberneckers gawking and spreading whispers at the drop of a hat. You know, something that would be a plot point in Desperate Housewives. There might even be something that you've personally experienced, even if it's not something illegal. Everyday scandals can be anything, from someone leaving their partner for a nanny 10 years their junior, to the couple at the end of the street throwing regular swinger parties. When it comes to the law-breaking scandals, it's not unheard of for police to bust meth labs or cannabis-growing operations hidden away in unassuming residential buildings. Or, back in the day, something low-risk, low-reward still illegal, like selling pirated CDs and DVDs. I'm so old. What's a DVD? Well, today's case might have elements of these minor scandals. We're going to be focusing entirely on the lives of one married couple who were rarely seen without each other, and you, like their own neighbors, would never have been able to guess what they were getting up to in private. A lot of the information available on this case is from an incredibly detailed and in-depth article from the Washingtonian, which will be linked in the show notes. This is the case of Kendall and Gwen Myers. Okay, on to the show. Walter Kendall Myers Jr. came from an incredibly privileged and wealthy background. He was born to parents Carol and, presumably, Walter Myers Sr. in Washington, D.C. on April 15, 1937. Kendall was the eldest of 5 children, all of whom were afforded expensive educations that all but handed them the keys to success. The level of comfort with which the family were able to live their lives was understandable given some of their ancestors further up the family tree. Kendall's grandfather on his mother's side was Gilbert Grosvenor, who boasted the title of National Geographic's first ever full-time editor for 55 years. His great-grandfather, also on his mother's side, was Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor credited with the creation of the telephone. And, to top it off, through his paternal lineage, Kendall was even related to the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft. With that sort of background, it might not surprise you that the family owned a number of estates. The children attended private schools, and childhood hobbies included sailing on the family yawl. Kendall's mother, Carol, taught him how to sail the vessel, which measured nearly 60 feet in length, an activity that brought the mother and son closer together. The yawl, built in 1917 and named Elsie, was a gift from Alexander Graham Bell to Gilbert Grosvenor before being passed down to the Myers. Kendall attended the private boarding school, or prep school, of Mercersburg Academy in Pennsylvania, and afterwards attended the Ivy League Brown University in Rhode Island. Later, he achieved a doctorate on the topic of European history from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. He was the only one of his siblings who, by choosing an arts degree, did not follow in their father's footsteps into sciences or medicine. It was clear to everyone who knew the family that Kendall was closer with his mother than his father, and took after her in many respects. She was always seeking out people who needed help, supporting Planned Parenthood, and volunteering to aid those in poverty. In Kendall's own words in an interview with the Washington Post, his mother would find, quote, the rebel of the people in trouble. And over the years, it became clear that Kendall, like Carol, had a strong affinity to the underdog. Gwendolyn Steingraber, on the other hand, had an upbringing so overshadowed by and unlike her future husband's that there is barely any information to be found on it. A year younger than Kendall, Gwen was born in South Dakota and raised between there and Iowa. She got married fairly young to a man named Chuck Tribalcock, taking his surname, and they had their first child when Gwen was only 19. They had 4 children in total, 1 girl and 3 boys, before divorcing in 1973. Something a neighbor to the family claimed happened because Chuck wasn't politically active enough for Gwen. This neighbor, who spoke to the Washingtonian for an in-depth article on Kendall and Gwen, had a lot to say about the Tribalcock family. He asked to remain anonymous due to working for the federal government himself, but spoke of how openly, and radically, left-wing Gwen and her sons were. He told the Washingtonian, quote, Gwen was always very stridently pro-feminist, pro-abortion. Roe v. Wade was a big deal for her. Very anti-Vietnam, anti-gun, absolutely hated Nixon with a passion, and said he was the devil. Her sons, he claimed, would brag about their radical politics and showed him their membership to the Communist Party. He even reported 2 of them to the U.S. Army as communists through a vetting form he submitted in 1985. Politically, Gwen and her sons were vocal about these incredibly controversial stances. In her 30s, Gwen found herself drawn to the politics of George McGovern, the staunchly anti-war Democratic presidential nominee in 1972. While still in her hometown of Aberdeen, South Dakota, this drove her to begin doing volunteer work as a legislative aide for the U.S. Senator James Aburesk. This later led to her moving to Washington, D.C. for a new role, this time a paid position as a member of Aburesk's Capitol Hill staff. Gwen was briefly married for the second time to a man she met through her political networking. She moved to Colorado with him. Then, when the relationship ended, she returned to D.C. to continue working with Aburesk. When Aburesk declined re-election in 1979, he arranged for Gwen to take up a job at the Public Utilities Commission in Pierre, South Dakota, so that she could move home and care for her ailing mother. By this point, she had finally met Kendall Myers. But we've skipped some of his history, so let's go back in time a little to catch up to this point in the timeline. After graduating from Johns Hopkins, Kendall decided to serve with the U.S. Army. He was stationed in West Germany from 1959 to 1962 and gained fluency in Czech so that he could monitor broadcasts from then Czechoslovakia. Although the U.S. had been instrumental in helping to found Czechoslovakia following the First World War, in the decades since relations had worsened largely due to the communism entrenched in Czechoslovakian politics. In essence, during his time stationed in Germany, Kendall was spying on the communists of Eastern Europe. Following his return from Europe, Kendall married Maureen Walsh, a medical student studying at Brown University. At 20 years old, she was 7 years younger than Kendall with none of the financial backing and world experience of her husband. Even so, she went from strength to strength in her studies, in becoming a mother of 2 children and later in gaining a PhD in microbiology. Maureen and Kendall separated in September 1974, with the divorce being finalized in 1977. According to the Washingtonian, she went on to become a pioneer in the field of HIV and AIDS treatment. Meanwhile, Kendall wasn't doing so well. He had gotten his own PhD from Johns Hopkins by this stage, and had a teaching position at its School of Advanced International Studies. But the role wasn't one with much upward movement. On separating with Maureen, he moved back in with his mother, returning to live in his childhood home that was worth millions of dollars. Outside of work, he spent his hours leisurely playing tennis and dining out with wealthy family and friends. It was while he was living there that we get a glimpse of a darker side to Kendall Myers. One evening in November of 1975, Kendall had been spending time with his family. After what he claimed to be 2 light scotches, a glass of wine, and 1 dinner later, he asked if he could borrow his mother's car so he could buy cigarettes. He then proceeded to drive recklessly through a residential neighborhood, careening directly into 3 teenagers who were loading items into a parked car. 16-year-old Susan Slattery was killed. Her boyfriend Peter suffered a broken femur, and Peter's friend Brian was hospitalized for several months after his legs were shattered by the impact. The car they had been crushed against was totaled. Kendall suffered only a grazed knee and a cut on his chin. A witness to the aftermath of the crash, a woman named Lucy, said, "I had assumed the driver was using drugs or something. It was amazing. It made no sense. He seemed absolutely dazed as he was led into a house." Brian, one of the 3 victims, also thought something wasn't right. "He never saw us or even braked, just plowed into us and crushed the 3 of us between the 2 vehicles." Though Kendall claimed to feel dizzy and faint, a blood alcohol test showed that he was not over the limit to drive. I think it's worth noting, though, that he wasn't tested until several hours after the crash, and was never tested for the presence of narcotics. Incredibly, he decided to plead not guilty to a charge of negligent homicide, but was convicted all the same. And yet, the death of a 16-year-old girl and the grievous, traumatic injuries of 2 17-year-old boys because of Kendall Myers' driving only landed him a sentence of 3 years unsupervised probation. Susan Slattery's family were understandably outraged by the verdict, and by a letter sent to them by Kendall following the crash. In this letter, he didn't apologize or take any accountability for the devastating loss he had inflicted on them. And to add insult to injury, the letter ended with, quote, "It is a tragedy for me too." Susan's father filed a wrongful death case with the district court, and they were awarded $85,000 in compensation. According to a sister-in-law, whose wedding to her brother Susan never got to attend, they never even recuperated from it. She went on to add, "Everybody thought Myers got off scot-free because his family was so powerful." And I'm inclined to agree. That was probably the case. 5 months after the trial, Kendall's divorce with Maureen was finalized. Maureen received full custody of their 2 children, and the court eventually had to lean on Kendall in order for him to actually pay the child support owed to his ex-wife. He repeatedly ended up with thousands of dollars in arrears for failing to pay the fees, despite being from such an immensely wealthy and, apparently, enabling family himself. It appears that it was around this time that Kendall and Gwen met for the first time. A friend of the couple and colleague of Gwen's, Wendy Grider, noted that the 2 seemed incredibly unlike each other, and yet, it just worked. They really enjoyed each other. Kendall took a brief sabbatical when Gwen left for South Dakota to care for her mother so that he could move with her, and on his return to D.C., he was employed as a contract instructor at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. Apparently, in the 2 years between leaving and returning to D.C., something clicked in Kendall that aligned him closer to the politics that Gwen's family had been entrenched in for years. One thing the couple bonded over intensely was the country of Cuba. They came together in the short window of time where the U.S. was attempting to foster a more friendly relationship with Cuba, which allowed them more insight into the nation and its workings. Senator Aburesk had instilled a passion for the nation in Gwen while they were working together, as he was a strong proponent of ending the economic embargo the U.S. had placed on Cuba. And in 1978, Wendy Grider invited a number of her colleagues and their partners, including Gwen and Kendall, to a brunch at her apartment that she had organized on behalf of her friend, Carlos Ciano. Carlos had an eerily similar upbringing to Kendall, one of wealth and luxury passed down through the family, but Kendall was an all-American boy who had happily settled into this life of comfort, taken to academia, and was employed by the state. Carlos, however, was a Cuban government official. His family had owned a timber plantation, but this was seized by Fidel Castro's revolutionaries. In response, Carlos joined the Cuban Revolution while the rest of his family fled from it and their home country. The rest of his life would be spent under the leadership of Castro. Later that same year, perhaps at Kendall's suggestion, Carlos Ciano presented a lecture at the Foreign Service Institute. The audience was composed of a number of State Department employees and instructors, including Kendall himself. Then, in December of 1978, out of that number of employees, Carlos invited only Kendall and 2 of his colleagues to spend 2 weeks with him in Cuba. By this point, Carlos Ciano had identified Kendall and Gwen Myers as potential traitors to the United States of America, and sought to secure the DC couple as spies for the Cuban government. Carlos, who was in reality an intelligence officer for the Cuban Intelligence Service, used Kendall's Cuba trip to assess or develop Kendall's potency as a new agent. Kendall's enthusiasm and affinity for Castro and his government must have convinced Carlos, because once Kendall returned to Gwen, Carlos visited the couple in South Dakota to officially recruit them to the cause. Okay, be honest with me. Who is expecting treason through spycraft as the reason Kendall and Gwen caused scandal among their neighbors when I mentioned it in the introduction? Did I bury the lead? This story is wild. Let's continue. Their sympathies with Cuba and its people were deep enough that they agreed with Carlos's terms. On their return to Washington, D.C. in 1979, both parties would communicate classified information with the Cuban Intelligence Service. Although Gwen, or Agent 123, did not have a position that could afford her any level of security clearance, Kendall, Agent 202, very much did. It wasn't a great leap from the Foreign Service Institute of the State Department to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Their contacts in Cuban intelligence encouraged this move, directing Kendall to continue with the State Department, but also to involve himself with the CIA, if at all possible. Kendall applied for the CIA under this directive, and although he made it to the interview stage, his application was ultimately unsuccessful. Kendall believed he was rejected because they asked him about his first marriage, and he refused to speak about it. But Gwen had other suspicions. She believed the rejection came because Kendall was a bad liar when it came to the polygraph test, something that was apparently issued when assessing someone's suitability for the CIA, but not for those within the State Department. So Kendall continued on working within the familiar grounds of the State Department. The Cuban connection also led to another step being taken in the relationship between Kendall and Gwen. Despite both parties having been previously married, they seemed content to remain living together without taking any religious vows or making any formal pledges to each other. However, Kendall was advised that getting a security clearance for his job would be easier if he were married, and it's entirely possible the only reason he and Gwen wed was to further their espionage goals. According to a neighbor of the Myers, Gwen all but told her this was the case. This neighbor, Jackie Gallagher, said that Kendall was told that if he wanted to get a clearance, it was a good idea if they got married. So he got down on one knee and asked her to marry him. They married in May 1982, and Kendall first received top-secret security clearance in 1985. In addition to this, his clearance level was upgraded to allow him access to sensitive, compartmented information in 1999. Meanwhile, Gwen worked in a bank, adding to the facade they had built to look like a perfectly respectable, all-American couple, with just a few odd opinions here and there. Kendall Myers' roles put him in a dangerously powerful position. While the Foreign Service Institute he taught about, well, foreign services, his specialization being Western Europe, he lectured about everything you might need to know before working with or in specific countries in their particular line of work. The employees who filtered through his doors included CIA operatives preparing for sensitive overseas assignments, and their identities could easily have passed from Kendall to the Cuban Intelligence Service and into the hands of countries deemed to have antagonistic relationships with the USA. His progression into the Bureau of Intelligence and Research only gave him more opportunities to betray the U.S. government. His position as senior analyst and the increased security clearances he was afforded meant he had access to information from across the board, which, at the very least, included all 18 of the U.S. intelligence agencies, and may well have included sensitive information from other countries beyond their borders. But back to 1979, when Kendall and Gwen were first recruited into the ranks of Cuban intelligence forces. Did anyone sense anything had changed about the couple? Not particularly. One neighbor was confused about their sudden silence on the topic of Cuba when he tried to tell them about a trip he had taken there, but there could have been any number of reasons their prior interest in the country could have faded. It was odd that they were still happy to voice their opinions on other controversial topics, but to each their own, right? After all, according to one colleague of Kendall's, he had never even heard the man speak about Latin America as a whole, never mind Cuba specifically. Maybe people just believed there was another reason for any odd behavior displayed by the Myers. In late 1979, before they left South Dakota for D.C., Gwen's 17-year-old son, Tony, and Kendall himself were caught running a marijuana-growing operation in the basement. Kendall challenged the legality of the apprehension in court, but it appears they eventually pled guilty to the charges in exchange for the record later being expunged. This probably meant they could more or less pretend it didn't happen by the time they got back to the capital to begin their espionage properly. To communicate with their handlers, the Myers were provided with funds to acquire a shortwave radio. Tuned to a specific frequency, communications were carried out in a code that began with repetitions of the word atención, followed by a series of numbers. These numbers were then decrypted by a computer decryption program also provided to them. These coded messages would address code names, coordinate information drop-offs, and instruct the couple on what to do or where to go.
This holiday season, give the men in your life the ultimate gift of confidence with the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra by Manscaped. Whether it's for your partner, brother, or that friend who seriously needs a grooming upgrade, this all-in-one kit has everything he needs to look and feel his best. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra is the star of the show, perfect for precise, smooth trims whether he's getting ready for a holiday date night or just keeping things fresh for family gatherings. And don't forget the Weed Whacker 2.0. Because no one needs rogue nose hair or ear hair stealing the spotlight during dinner. Manscaped even includes post-shave care for the most precious ornaments with the Crop Soother Ball Aftershave Lotion and Crop Preserver Anti-Chafing Ball Deodorant. Plus, 2 bonus gifts, the Boxers 2.0 and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag, making this the ultimate grooming experience. Join over 11 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code Lanie, L-A-N-I-E, at manscaped.com. That's Lanie, L-A-N-I-E, for 20% off plus free shipping. Trust me, this is the MVP of holiday gifts. The holidays are here and it's time to spark something uncommon with gifts from Uncommon Goods. They've taken the stress out of holiday shopping by curating incredible hand-picked gifts that bring joy, wonder, and that "how did you know" feeling. I've already found some favorites like their personalized cutting boards and handmade jewelry crafted by independent artisans. These aren't your average gifts. They're meaningful, unique, and often handmade. They're perfect for everyone on your list, from the holiday host to the die-hard sports fan. When you shop at Uncommon Goods, you're supporting small businesses and artists, and with every purchase, they donate $1 to a nonprofit of your choice. So far, they've given over $3 million. Don't wait. Many of these items are made in small batches, so that means they sell out really fast. Get 15% off your next gift by visiting uncommongoods.com/Lanie, L-A-N-I-E. That's uncommongoods.com/Lanie for 15% off. Uncommon Goods. We're all out of the ordinary. Now, thank you again to Ayden for hosting this episode. As you can hear, I do not sound great at all. Tomorrow, November 16th, is my birthday. So make sure you shop these vendors because that helps support the show. Okay, bye guys.
While at work, Kendall would commit details of confidential documents to memory, sometimes taking brief notes, and sometimes even clandestinely bringing the documents themselves home for Gwen to process. Any pilfered documents would then be hidden in books in the Myers home, and there were plenty of these, since Gwen worked in a bookstore between the years of 2000 to 2002. Back at work, Kendall would surreptitiously interrogate his colleagues for further information, keeping his questions casual, not prying, so they wouldn't suspect him of any foul play. Obviously, we've no way of knowing what exactly that top-secret information was, but according to court documents, at least some of it pertained to the U.S. and their European allies' sources and methods of intelligence gathering. Once he brought the necessary information to Gwen, she could compile them into decrypted packages that could be easily secreted to their handlers at meetings. Sometimes they would meet their handlers face-to-face, going out to dinner with Carlos Ciano or meeting other identified agents in public places. But often, the passing of information was more calculated than that. They would do dead drops, leaving the packages at inconspicuous places that had been designated by radio transmission, so that when their handlers arrived to pick up the packages later that day, nobody would see them together. They would bump into each other on the street, slipping a piece of paper from one hand to the other as they did so. Sometimes, Gwen would take her package into the grocery store and place it in her shopping cart, then swap her cart with another agent's, and carry on picking up groceries. Sometimes, Kendall and Gwen would even travel to Latin America under false names, presumably under fake passports provided by the Cuban intelligence service to convey important information. One such time, around New Year of 1995, they traveled first to Mexico and then on to Cuba under the names Elizabeth and George. They did so for the honor of meeting Fidel Castro himself. This marked a career and personal high that the couple would ride for the rest of their lives, and probably continue to do so to this day, despite where they've ended up. From the day Kendall Myers first gained security clearance to the day he retired from the U.S. State Department, he was also defrauding the U.S. government. To retain security clearance, Kendall had to undergo regular background checks to ensure he was still suitable to perform in his position of trust. His failure to disclose Gwen's and his involvement with the Cuban intelligence service to the State Department meant that every time he received his government salary, he did so under false representation. This particular aspect of their criminal activity is more of a formality than the rest of them, so it is just the cherry on top of the decades of treason the couple willingly carried out. And yet, despite both Kendall and Gwen's staunch belief in the Cuban Revolution and that they were helping in a fight for liberation and justice through their actions, they eventually became paranoid. In late 2001, a woman named Ana Belén Montes was arrested for spying on behalf of Cuba for nearly 30 years. Montes and the Myers didn't know each other, but she lived barely half a mile from the Myers' home and likely operated under very similar circumstances to the couple. Adding more weight to their developing paranoia, the age of surveillance was now upon them. With CCTV popping up in every supermarket and on every street corner, it became almost impossible for the couple to make the drop-offs without their every movement being tracked. They then moved on to anonymously attending random internet cafes and using their internet to send encrypted emails, before this too stopped. At this point, the Myerses believed it was too risky to continue meeting their handlers in DC and other U.S. cities. Over the next few years, the couple traveled internationally to meet with Cuban intelligence agents. Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, and Argentina were among the locations Kendall and Gwen vacationed to with nefarious intentions. And Kendall later admitted to carrying out meetings in European cities such as Italy and Prague. In October 2007, Kendall retired from the State Department and espionage altogether, In his final year of employment, the computer he used at work revealed he had accessed more than 200 classified intelligence reports directly involving Cuba alone, and he had access to classified information every single day for 12 years. There's no telling just how much of it left his hands. But they managed to quit while they were ahead. Despite looking over their shoulders for the last 5 or so years, neither Myers' spouse had ever been considered suspicious in the eyes of the law. Ostensibly retired, Gwen and Kendall dedicated as much time as they could to sailing. They took a trip to Sweden in 2009, purely to visit the site where their custom-built yacht, named Helene, was being crafted. Once it had made the journey back to the States, the couple spent much of their time drifting lazily in Maryland waters or taking navigation classes to prepare for longer trips aboard their $350,000 private yacht. They had everything they could possibly want: a beautiful home, 6 children, 7 grandchildren, a luxury yacht, and each other. They both had gracefully retired from admirable careers and silently stepped away from the world of espionage right under the nose of the U.S. government. And yet, the pair had itchy feet. As much as it had been stressful for them in many ways, they still loved Cuba and the sense of purpose it had given them, individually and as a couple. So when Cuban operatives reached out to them for the first time in years via email, fronting as a Mexican art dealer and saying their collection of art pieces was always open to the couple, they jumped to respond. Unfortunately for them, they had no idea that the FBI had begun monitoring their means of communication, and, in fact, they had the couple in their sights before they had even purchased their dream boat. By 2006, it had become clear to the FBI that there was someone untrustworthy in the State Department. They had been aware of the usage of shortwave radios to communicate with Cuban operatives for some time. Remember, they had arrested Ana Belén Montes in 2001 and could decipher the numeric code, but their problem was that they could not identify who the messages were for. It took years to narrow down the suspect list, but every so often another clue would surface to guide the investigation. Firstly, they knew they were looking for 2 agents, likely a couple, since 2 different identification numbers were used in the messages. Then, there were messages transmitted in Morse code, an indicator that at least one of the agents in this pair were ex-military and had at some point held a role in intelligence operations. Kendall Myers fell in that category due to his time spent with the U.S. Army in Germany, monitoring transmissions from Czechoslovakia during the early 60s. Then, there were more personal clues. The FBI had records of decoded messages going as far back as 1996. And one of these sent in November of that year mentioned a new residence. Within weeks, Gwen and Kendall moved into a new home. Further messages from that time included details about one of the agents having a tumor in their shoulder, and according to medical records, Gwen Myers had a tumor removed from her shoulder just after Christmas. Obviously, there are likely a plethora of details about this case that are on a need-to-know basis. And even though I would really like to know, sadly, we are not among that number. However, what we do know is that by 2008, the FBI were able to justify having Kendall and Gwen Myers put under surveillance and searching the Myers' property without their knowledge. The Washingtonian article lists the almost comical series of items that the FBI discovered during their initial searches. Quote, the Sony radio, a sailing guide to Cuban waters, a book entitled On Becoming Cuban by Luis A. Perez Jr., and The Spy's Bedside Book by Graham Greene and his brother Hugh. They also found a 1978 diary in which Kendall Myers had recorded his thoughts about a 2-week visit to Cuba during the Carter administration. I wonder if either of them, at any point, had enough of a sense of irony to hide some of the top-secret documents they pilfered in The Spy's Bedside Book. Probably not. The contents of Kendall's Cuban diary were almost ridiculously damning as, according to a press release from the Office of Public Affairs, they explicitly declared his affinity for Fidel Castro and the Cuban government. He wrote that his relationship with his home country was rapidly becoming bitter. that watching the evening news was a radicalizing experience and condemned America's corporate greed and inadequate healthcare among a whole host of other issues. It was also the diary that identified the man who had recruited them as Carlos Ciano, who had long since retired to Havana and was out of the FBI's reach. And sorry, I really need to ask, why on earth did Kendall keep this diary just lying around in his home more than 30 years later? It's a miracle the man never got caught before then. It isn't clear when, but the indictment later served against Kendall and Gwen indicates that both their home and their yacht were likely bugged. They apparently were often recorded talking about their affinity with Cuba and the things they did as part of Cuban intelligence, motivating and reassuring each other that they were doing the right thing all along. And the final nail in the coffin, as if there even needed to be one, was a man named Hector. His name was not actually Hector, but that is what the Washingtonian article calls him, and they haven't led me astray so far. This Hector got in touch with Kendall and Gwen only a few months after they had been invited to peruse the collection of art pieces offered by the Cuban operative wearing the email disguise of a Mexican art dealer. Hector was, of course, an agent with the FBI who had been monitoring the couple's emails ever since they became potential suspects. He knew about the email exchange, and on Kendall's birthday on April 15th, Hector made his first move. Hector came bearing gifts of a Cuban cigar and good wishes for a specific Cuban intelligence official, and hooked Kendall with an invitation of sorts. He told them they wanted his opinion on Cuba's current turbulent situation and new administration. This led to a series of hotel room meetings between Hector, Kendall, and Gwen, where the couple, now in their 70s, unwittingly dug themselves even deeper into trouble in front of a concealed recording devices. During these meetings, Kendall professed how much they missed working with Cuba and its people, and that they were incredibly important to them. Even being recorded on videotape saying about being a spy, I was actually thinking it would be fun to get back into it. They detailed the top secret information they had transmitted to the Cuban intelligence service, the way they handled intel drop-offs, their code names, how they had traveled abroad to meet handlers, their meeting with Fidel Castro. In essence, they told Hector everything. They met 3 times in total, and when Kendall and Gwen arrived for what was supposed to be a 4th meeting, they were instead greeted by the FBI and a pair of handcuffs each. They were arrested on June 4, 2009. By the end of that year, 73-year-old Kendall pleaded guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy to commit espionage and 2 counts of wire fraud, while 72-year-old Gwen pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to gather and transmit national defense information. As part of their penalty, they agreed to forfeit over $1.7 million in cash and property, an amount which included every bit of the salary Kendall had fraudulently received from the federal government over the years. They got to keep the yacht, though. To those who knew the couple, the revelation of this monumental subterfuge was unthinkable. A friend who knew them from the marina where they kept their yacht put it pretty well when he said, "When I heard they were arrested, I felt like they had arrested Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny." And the comparisons weren't far off. Students who had been taught by Kendall described him as ditzy and disorganized, while Gwen was known by all their neighbors as a kind and gracious woman who would go out of her way to create little acts of kindness to those around her. And, in a way, it almost makes sense. Kendall and Gwen maintained that everything they did was to help the Cuban people defend their revolution, and that they had no intention of harming the U.S. or gaining any monetary compensation for selling state secrets. After all, as former senator and Gwen's former boss Aburesk said, "What's Cuba going to do to the U.S.? Invade? Are you kidding?" But that mindset is as naive and foolish as it is simplistic. Did the deluded idealism of the Myers truly lead them to believe their classified information would profit the oppressed people of Cuba and go no further? Or deep down, did they know what former DIA counterintelligence officer Chris Simmons expressed? Kendall Myers had access to more secrets than Cuba could possibly have used itself, so the Cubans acted as information brokers, selling on what they had almost certainly to Moscow. It's a profit-making enterprise and has been for years. Regardless of which of these is true, if they genuinely wished for nothing more than to aid a struggling people and be a part of Cuba's history, culture, and politics, there was a simple solution for it. As United States District Judge Reggie B. Walton told the couple at sentencing, if you believed in the revolution, you should have defected. Instead, though, they reaped the benefits of U.S. culture and capitalism, living in luxury due to their position, privilege, and inherited wealth, and endangered the lives of others for the sake of their so-called affinity with those in Cuba. In July 2010, Kendall was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He had agreed to this sentence as part of a deal that offered Gwen considerable leniency for the part she played in their 3 decades of espionage. Gwen received the significantly lighter sentence of 81 months, or just under 7 years, and it took 14 months off of that for time already served. It appears this leniency was also offered in part due to her poor health, as by that time she had suffered at least 1 heart attack, as well as a number of minor strokes. In order to make visiting easier on their large family, Judge Walton recommended the pair be placed in prisons relatively nearby one another. The scandal of this story may have drawn itself out over decades, but the story itself ends pretty suddenly. Once Kendall and Gwendolyn met up with Hector, it was all over. The trial didn't drag on, and it looks as though no appeals were made. Fidel Castro came out to decline all knowledge of the Myers' efforts on behalf of his country, but said, if the accusations were true, they were deserving of all the honors in the world. That must have been of little solace to Kendall, in prison for the remainder of his life. If all went to plan, Gwen would have been released around the end of 2015, but I could not find confirmation of this. And that's pretty much it. All being said, I want to end the episode reminding everyone that, in all this, a life was lost. Susan Slattery was only 16 years old when she lost her life due to Kendall's selfish and reckless behavior. She wanted to be a special education teacher when she left school, but she never got the chance. Her life should have been mourned and celebrated, but instead, it has been reduced to a footnote in the story of the 2 spies who somehow dodged being caught for 30 years. Susan isn't even mentioned in most articles about the Myerses, but I'll be damned if she isn't mentioned here. Okay, listeners, thank you for joining me in this episode as we file away another true crime case. If you like this podcast, please review it on Apple Podcast or your podcast player of choice. It's a big help. Follow their socials. They're active on Twitter at @truecrime_cases, Facebook at facebook.com/truecrimecaseswithlanie, and Instagram at @truecrimecaseswithlanie. Their website is truecrimecasespodcast.com, and they'd love to hear your episode suggestions. Send them an email at tcfcpod@gmail.com if you would like to reach out. And if you enjoyed me as your guest host, I am Adrian or Ayden. Either way, I am usually over at Susto, the podcast of ooky, spooky, scary stories centered on paranormal folklore from Latin American and Hispanic cultures. You can listen to Susto on any podcast platform. That's SUSTO. You can find me at sustopodcast.com and across every social media platform at @SustoPodcast. Once again, thank you so much to Lanie and to True Crime Cases with Lanie for having me on as a guest host today. Lanie, I hope you are better by the time this comes out. Big props to you for reading all of that information every single episode. You are a star. You are an inspiration, and I am proud to call you a ghoul friend. And to the new ghoul friends listening, once again, thank you for being here. Hopefully, I will see you all over on Susto.